Why is this important? Well, first of all, New Zealand's score is continuing to drop in the Corruption Perception Index, and last week, Transparency International globally released the 2025 CPI. It showed New Zealand's score has fallen by 2 points for the 4th consecutive year. That's a 10% drop overall. And while we still rank 4th equal with Norway, this continued slide reflects diminishing confidence among business experts and international assessors in the integrity of the public sector. Our declining CPI score signals growing risks to the country's domestic integrity and global reputation. And secondly, the report from the Anti-Corruption Workforce Pilot, also released this month, revealed that internal fraud and corruption in New Zealand's public sector are likely significantly underreported, with potential losses of 823 million to 10.24 billion annually. The pilot, which involved 6 agencies, identified more than 400 cases of suspected wrongdoing, but highlighted inconsistent controls, weak detection, and gaps in reporting mechanism. So we're going to begin the session with brief opening comments from our panelists, and then I'm going to ask them some questions that we discussed earlier. And then after that, there'll be time for questions from you, the participants, via the chat function. We will conclude the session at 9:30, but I need to leave about 9 o'clock, and we'll hand over to our Executive Director at Transparency International New Zealand, Julie Haggie. So I would first of all like to introduce Suzanne Snively, who, as I've said, is an expert in business integrity and obviously a well-known economist as well, and she's our own former chair. Some of you probably know Suzanne from her numerous roles and extensive background and experience. And I'd like to invite her to discuss the connection between economic success, corruption prevention, and detection. So take it away, Suzanne. Thank you.
I think it's really important to put into context just how small New Zealand is and how far away we are from the rest of the world. So the Corruption Perception Index has been a major contributor to our positive brand image since its inception back in the mid-90s. And a drop like this is really serious because it means that things like how we trade, how we're taken as exporters, will be more complex in the future than it has been. Just look at it this way. If our economy was even twice as big and you were an exporter, you would have probably at least twice as much resource to put into your branding and marketing than we have. As our index falls, it means that it's much harder for us to have a brand without working on it in other ways. I'll give you an example. The Chinese ambassador, Chris Elder, told me probably a good 15 years ago that when New Zealand businesses came to China, they got entry immediately because the Chinese trusted New Zealand because of the Corruption Perception Index. I just wanted to also, because of the particular audience that we've got, talk a little bit about this fall and what it might mean. The key thing to keep in mind is this is a perceptions index. And the irony, in a way, over the last 15 years is that we've learned a lot more about corruption than we knew then. The then Public Service Commissioner, State Services Commissioner, told me that he had one KPI, and that was that the Corruption Perception Index would continue to be positive and New Zealand would continue to be #1. And I said to him, but what do we do in the public service to make sure that that Corruption Perception Index stays at #1? And his answer to me was, and and I wish I had a video of this, because it's one of those things you have in the back of your mind for the rest of your life, but it's you've got to, some people may be disbelieving. He said, we don't need to do anything. We are of a country of integrity, and that will always come through in the perceptions index. Curiously, since then, and many of you will have been involved, we've done a lot to actually address corruption in New Zealand. The Serious Fraud Serious Fraud Office has addressed corruption as well as fraud, even though fraud was initially its mandate. And now we've got this really progressive study that's been done by Dan and Rose, which we'll talk about today. Many of you will know of other things that have been done over this period. We've got a really modern approach to beneficial ownership. At the time, we had 15,000 or so trusts. As soon as the new legislation came in under the Key government, the number of trusts dropped to 3,000, around 3,000, because many of those were actually overseas owned. And as soon as we brought in stricter beneficial ownership legislation, it had an immediate impact. Bryce Edwards has put an excellent article out today about the diaries that MPs must keep. And of course, they've been, haven't been perfect, but they're there. And we've got a lever now to insist on better keeping of diaries and meetings, so we can manage lobbying better than we have in the past. Other legislation you'll all know about over this period of time. It isn't easy. It takes years and years and years for government officials to, first of all, put together the legislation and then finally get a political party in government or a coalition in government who will actually allow it to pass through. And so I just want to say congratulations to those watching for the hard work that you've done. And in a way, the drop in the corruption perception index is an indication of what you've done, because a number of aspects of corruption are much more transparent in New Zealand than they were 15 years ago. That doesn't mean that we have to stop working. And as I learned as my time as chair, there's nothing better than a drop in the corruption perception index. For those of you who have been angling for years to get your ministers to listen, than to go and talk about this drop and how serious it is, as I said earlier, to our exporters and to our overall country's reputation when we try to do anything globally.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. That was very comprehensive and very interesting. And yeah, I hope quite a wake-up call in terms of what it means economically, not just for moral reasons or whatever. So I would now, we still don't seem to have Francois, unfortunately, who's overseas. He lives overseas. So while we wait for him, we'll move up the speaking order, and I will would now like to introduce Dan Eaton and Rose Ream from the Serious Fraud Office. And Dan will describe the kinds of corruption the Serious Fraud Office is dealing with and what changes there have been over the past few years, while Rose may offer supporting information on the actual pilot. So thank you, Dan and Rose.
Thank you. I'm just unmuting myself. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thanks, Debbie, for that introduction, and thank you, Suzanne, for those insightful points that you made. And I thought you were particularly articulate there on that catch-22 that we often feel at the Serious Fraud Office, is that when we're doing our job by exposing these things, we also run the risk of lowering our ranking on the index. But there's nothing. There's no way to tackle these issues other than to face them, I think, head on. So we've seen some interesting and significant developments over the last few years, which I think will help with this conversation. So the number of complaints that we receive annually has grown by about 20% a year over the last couple of years. And while all of that isn't corruption, approximately 40% of our casebook now consists of corruption-related matters across all sectors, including a number in the public sector. The cases we do take on have also increased in complexity and are taking significantly longer to investigate and prosecute. We would estimate that the difference between a complex case and a non-complex case can often be up to about a 35% difference in terms of time. Our Auckland transport case, some of you will remember that from 2016, was a seminal and highly publicized case which sort of showcased to the public what corruption looks like in the New Zealand context, and what that it's not just cash, backhanders and brown envelopes. And in that case, an external supplier paid bribes to public officials for roading contracts, and it looked like this. The contracts were secured after a senior manager set up and then corruptly exerted influence over the contract selection process. The corrupt behavior also involved paying bribes to the staff who approved the invoices, which allowed the corruption to continue undetected. The kind of bribes that we were seeing were money, but also international and domestic holidays, electronics, including mobile phones and iPads, fine dining experiences, that kind of thing. And since that particular case, nearly 10 years ago, in 2016, we've received steady reporting on domestic corruption cases, and we receive complaints and tip-offs both about central government agencies and local government. And one of the most common areas for corruption, I don't think it'll surprise anyone here, is public procurement. And that's not surprising given the amount of money involved. And every year our public sector spends over $51 billion on goods and services. So this procurement process, from the planning stages through to the contract management, remains where we believe the government activity is most vulnerable to waste and fraud and corruption due to the size of the financial flows involved. What we're also seeing too, though, is benefit in kind bribery. So public officials allegedly getting work done on their homes or other in-kind benefits in return for business. Think swimming pools, driveways, home extensions, painting and decorating, that kind of thing. And these non-monetary forms of kickback can be complex to unwind, and it's not so much a case of following the money, but following the absence of the money. We also do continue to see examples of cash, travel, vehicles, and other gifts and benefits. And if you keep an eye out, our Counter Fraud Centre is in the next few weeks going to publish a series of case studies which share insights into some recent SFO corruption cases and how they were perpetrated. Another issue which we're unfortunately seeing is corrupt actors or individuals in public service moving from agency to agency. Our recent case involving Mrs. Sharma is a good example of that issue, and it involved a former property and facilities manager at Oranga Tamariki, our children's agency, working with her husband to defraud the agency of $2 million. And following her resignation from Oranga Tamariki, she then moved on to Waka Kotahi, our transport agency, sort of highlighting that need for pre-employment screening and vigilance in that kind of area. So basically moving agency hopping to evade law enforcement or prosecution. And I'll stop here, but our anti-corruption task force pilot that we've just completed and put a report out on also highlights that risk that bad actors can move around the public sector when we don't properly identify their conduct as being potentially criminal, or take steps to share intelligence or investigate allegations with a criminal lens. So, there are a number of, it does occur where an issue is treated as an employment matter and the person resigns, and and no further action occurs, and there's sometimes either a reluctance or an inability to share that private information between agencies. So those are the kind of things which we're highlighting in our report. I don't know, Rose, was there anything you wanted to add to that around the task force findings themselves?
No, I think that, your point around intelligence, and that's something that we're certainly wanting to shift the consciousness around, that, rather than seeing, an attempted bribe or something like that as an isolated event, we're saying we were really wanting to shift that consciousness around, well, what might that be linked to? And, we have a lot more thought now these days around transnational organized crime or other risks like foreign interference, and sometimes isolated instances teamed up with other instances in an intelligence picture can show much deeper or much more serious offending. So one of the reasons why we're really trying to change the thinking around this and to identify activity that might look innocuous but may be potentially criminal is so that we can also start to detect some of these more serious issues as well.
Okay, thank you both very much for that. Unfortunately, still no Francois, so we're going to move to the set questions now. And actually, I'm going, Suzanne's question, which you have already covered quite comprehensively in your opening talk, but perhaps I'll ask it of you if you want to reiterate anything. You have been a champion for integrity and accountability for many, many years, and including as chair of TINZ. Any further thoughts you have on integrity and accountability in New Zealand over the past 15 years and what it might take for us to improve our score in the CPI?
Thanks, Debbie. I think that in the meantime, if we're genuinely focused on corruption, we should forget the Corruptions Perception Index as the measure of success or otherwise. It's made up of a number of surveys, and the surveys don't necessarily reflect people that know a lot about New Zealand, although ironically, the part of the survey that is driving our fall is actually 2 surveys where the main people answering the questions are business people. And this highlights for me a challenge we've got with business, that there's not enough understanding amongst the business sector of how good our public sector is. And while Rose and Dan have both highlighted aspects of the public sector that need improvement, compared to other public sectors overseas, we still, in my mind, and again, this is obviously I'm prejudiced, we should still be right up there with Denmark as number 1. In fact, there are aspects of the Denmark public sector which are really quite frankly, don't meet the standard that we insist on our public sector. So then what should we do? Well, first and foremost, I think we need to continue what you all are doing, which is step by step, changing the legislation where required in order to better define corruption. When I was a kid, my family was very religious, and I have to say I spent a great deal of my life feeling guilty about sex, which, of course, if you've all seen Wuthering Heights, which you must, you'll know that this all has changed in our upbringing. And now I think the thing about New Zealanders is we all feel guilty about corruption. And this guilt that we feel about corruption means that it stays too much behind closed doors. This is, again, why I celebrate the work that the Serious Fraud Office has done, is they brought out into the open the areas where there is corruption, and that now means we can address them. Procurement, by the way, I just looked up the accounts for government spending. Total government spending for last year ending June was $94 billion. Dan just said that the procurement of central government was $51 billion. that suggests that about half of what government spends is on procurement. And yet, if you look closely at how we manage procurement after the bidding process, in general, I think the bidding processes are probably overly diligent, but the management of procurement after the bidding process, both in central and local government, is really not good. We don't put the resources into managing procurement that we need to. Now, ironically, we've got a huge opportunity right now, because when the government cut back government spending, this coalition government announced that it was cutting back government spending way back in October 2023, government agencies immediately deferred, delayed, or even dropped much of their procurement. The image that we tend to have in mind when we think of procurement is of large consultancies who are earning maybe $250 or more per hour. The reality is the majority of New Zealand procurement is your mom and pop and larger contractors, of course, but it's the people that are doing the school maintenance, that are doing the hospital maintenance, doing the road maintenance. And a lot of those contracts got dropped, but they're going to need to be reinstated. It would be good to figure out how we could encourage public officials to put in more rigorous approach to procurement as they have an increasing workload around these contracts. Because right now their workload will be much lower than it would have been back in 2023. So that's, I think, one of the big rocks where we could make a major change to corruption in New Zealand and would make a difference. You've asked me to look over the past 15 years, and I would really like people to go online and read the National Integrity Systems Assessment that Transparency International did back in 2013. It's very thorough, and there are a number of very thorough recommendations. When the Open Government Partnership was first set up, the government first signed up to it back in 2014, the State Services Commission, then called the State Services Commission, recognized that those recommendations gave it a list of things that it could do that would make a difference to corruption in New Zealand. And so if you go back and look at them, you'll see there's a lot of detail and a lot of things that could change. Two things that I will point to right now is better resourcing of the Serious Fraud Office and making sure that, amongst other things, corruption is a major part of its mandate and is funded properly. And the second one that I think needs serious consideration this year is political party funding. The electorate is not happy with the way in which political parties are funded. They've got their eye on the government and other political parties as to how they're running their campaigns. It couldn't be more timely to have a major initiative around political party funding.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Some really useful insights there. Now, I'm going to take one more question. I'm going to put one more question to Dan, and then I have the good news that Francois will be joining us very shortly in about a couple of minutes. So
he's here now. He's here now.
Oh, he's here now. So maybe we stop and go straight to Francois. Okay. Kia ora and welcome. Bonjour or bonsoir or whatever it is where you are, Francois. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the third of our panelists, Francois Valerian, Chair of Transparency International globally. When Francois was last in New Zealand in August 2024, he helped launch the Transparency International New Zealand research assessment into the effectiveness of anti-corruption agencies in fighting corruption. And he's going to speak for 5 minutes on what chapters report in corruption around the world and how it's showing up in the CPI, whether it's reflected in the CPI. So thank you, Francois.
Well, thank you very much, Debbie, and apologies all of you for being late. As you may imagine, there was a slight confusion, at least in my mind, between Tuesday and Wednesday. So I thought it was Wednesday, 8:30 p.m. and it was obviously Tuesday, 8:30 p.m. Wednesday, 8:30 a.m. for you. So apologies for that. And I'll go right to your question, Debbie. What we observed this year is not fundamentally different from what we observed last year or over the previous years. It is that we are missing enforcement, we are missing interest, and we are missing true commitment from certain governments. So let's start with enforcement. Over 30 years, our movement is a bit older than 30 years, right? The governments have been very good at enacting laws, creating institutions. But what is clearly missing is enforcement, is having the judiciary systems in place with adequate resources and funding and with independence from both political and economic powers. So that's the observation in most countries worldwide. Now we also have a concerning lack of interest on the part of some governments, let's say from the global north, some Western European governments, the British government, the French government. And that's concerning because those governments tend to think that corruption is behind them, that they've addressed the problem. And what we see is a culture of conflict of interest in those few countries which used to exercise leadership in the fight against corruption. Now, there is a specific country which was considered, at least in the past few years, as the leader in the global anti-corruption fight, and which had enacted the first global anti-corruption instrument, which was the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And this country now has quite officially chosen to favor what is presented as standard business practices, as routine business practices. If I'm quoting well, but I think I'm quoting it well, the presidential order, the US presidential order from 1 year ago, in which the current US administration decided to suspend the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And after this suspension, what happened was that the act was enforced again, but targeting non-US companies. And this makes me go to my final point of these few comments, which is that when you foster a culture of confrontation instead of cooperation, when you think that the right way to approach corruption, climate, a number of global issues is to enter into confrontation with your neighbors, with other countries, you are wrong. In an interconnected world, you are wrong, and you are also wrong for your own country. It is clearly suboptimal, also in game theory. So that is very concerning, and those are the few observations that I can share with you on the global CPI.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to go straight to your question that we had discussed that we wanted you to address, which is, it's just a little one. What does it take for a country to improve its score in the CPI?
So what's the recipe to improve a country's score? So I'm going to give you the recipe to improve a score and then the recipe to deteriorate a score so that you can have two recipes, because I think both are interesting. So, well, there are a few examples which are quite encouraging of countries which have made consistent progress in the Corruption Perceptions Index over years, over 10 years, over 12 years, 15 years. I'm thinking of a few European countries, Estonia, Armenia, which were countries from the former Soviet Union. So they had started fairly low in the Corruption Perceptions Index, but there has been a conscious mobilization of the political world, of the successive governments to achieve progress in the fight against corruption. And that's probably a key to achieving real success in the fight against corruption, that there is this collective awareness that this is important, this has to be addressed. And after having mentioned European countries, I will mention Asian countries. And there have been progress in the CPI in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh. In both countries, you've had a revolution which expelled a corrupt government, and then there have been efforts. We will see where these efforts lead, right? But there are efforts, and there have been efforts, also with the participation of the national TI chapters, to really try to recreate, refound a political society, a political order, but grounded on integrity. And sometimes there is a shock which brings about a change in the way the country is looking at corruption. It's been the case with Ukraine. When you look at Ukraine and Russia, since the beginning of the war, Russia has been constantly declining in the CPI. Ukraine has been constantly increasing. Why that? Because Ukraine is taking it seriously and not Russia. And now, what does it take to decrease in the score? The UK has decreased, France has decreased, and that's this culture of conflict of interest, this culture of now appointing ministers who are already indicted for corruption, which we observe in France. So those governments clearly do not take that seriously. And if you allow me to say a few words about New Zealand, which I know much less than you, so I won't give you lessons on how to behave in New Zealand. But my perception as a foreigner, but also someone who had the great pleasure and honor to be invited by you, Debbie, and Julie, and Susan, and TI New Zealand, that was 1.5 years ago, and that was after you had published, or New Zealand had published, this very interesting 2024 report on the state of the art in terms of anti-corruption fight in New Zealand. My perception is that there is a strong culture, collective culture of integrity in New Zealand. It is not the case of every country. France doesn't have this culture, but clearly New Zealand has this culture. This culture is clearly an asset. It can become a weakness if all citizens become convinced that all of them are honest and that corruption is really a problem for other countries. Whereas clearly New Zealand, as a country perceived as extremely clean and honest, can be targeted by corrupt and dirty money, because there is a global economy of corruption with $1 trillion a year, which are crossing borders to be invested in a few countries, in a few European countries, but also in Australia, and maybe not, I don't know, in New Zealand. But clearly New Zealand could be targeted by these corrupt people because they see New Zealand impeccable reputation and anti-corruption bodies which may not have the strength that is needed by this global economy of corruption.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to go to Dan, who hasn't answered a question yet, and then I've come back to you and Suzanne for a couple more questions as well. So Dan, your question relates to the anti-corruption workforce pilot, which is a strategic output. And we've been calling for an overall anti-corruption strategy. So what strategic view does the SFO have on that?
Thanks, Debbie. And thank you, Francois. Those are really insightful comments, all of which I thoroughly agree with. So we at the SFO, we have to take a strategic view of things, and that's partly because we're a small agency with a very specific mandate at the serious end of fraud and corruption, and we're built for deterrence, not for volume. So we do we prize highly thinking at a strategic level, and one indication of that is the trend of fraud and corruption is growing internationally, and New Zealand is not an outlier and is not immune in that case. And so we've, for example, in the last few years, we've got into the prevention business because you cannot investigate and prosecute your way out of these things. It's more of a pincer movement, and actually the value for money is in prevention. But we do pride ourselves in taking a strategic approach, and in 2023, for example, we published for the first time our strategic areas of focus. You'll find those on our website, and we've committed to updating those every 12 to 18 months. And we issued an updated set last year of 7 priority areas that we would focus on. And those areas of focus are used as a tool not only to educate the public, but also for prioritizing the cases we take on. 2 of the 7 areas of those 7 areas are dedicated to corruption-related offending. Also, as you pointed out, the Anti-Corruption Task Force, which we conducted over 6 months at the end of last year, was undertaken for strategic reasons, and that was to build a clearer system-wide picture of corruption and fraud across the public sector, with a view to understanding where the gaps and weaknesses are. And that's really in part to address a key challenge that we have around detection, and where then to most effectively focus the resources that we do have. What we've got is this report now, which in turn can be used to take a targeted approach to agency prevention and law enforcement efforts within our mandate. But also we're in the process of providing advice to government on options for future improvements at a system level. One of the things that we've been really pleased with in the way that the task force report has been received and the media attention that it's got is that the attention didn't go immediately just to, gosh, look at those 6 agencies. What we were really trying to highlight is system things that need attention, not individual agency issues. So we do believe that taking a strategic view is important. As a policy person who's been involved in development of at least a couple of strategies at government level, I was responsible for delivering a defense strategy and a national security strategy. Strategies can give a false sense of action and doing things, and a strategy is usually only as good as the action plan and the well-funded action plan that sits under it. So we would advocate going forward that substance over form, and whatever that is, whether it's a specific strategy or a commitment to work across sectors, a strategic approach is actually essential. And so, we obviously had the working across sectors. We're not the only agency involved in the production of this report. Public Service Commission and police were involved in that task force, but also we've been looking to work with the private sector. We launched an anti-bribery, foreign bribery campaign and a whistleblowing tool earlier last year, and we did that launch alongside Business New Zealand, and have worked with other businesses in trying to get that word out. So strategic approach is something that we are very keen on at the Serious Fraud Office.
Great. Now I've got I would just want to remind people that the chat function is available if you to ask your questions. Maybe if you could also indicate if there's a particular panelist you would like to answer your question. Now I'm just going to go quickly to probably what will have to be our last question from me, and that is I'm going to ask it very briefly of both Francois and Suzanne, in that order. So Francois, we're heading into an election year in New Zealand. What do you think voters should be looking for in leadership that would strengthen our national honour and integrity? So I'll get you to answer that briefly, and then to Suzanne. I'm going to have to say ka kite anō, I'll see you later, and hand over to Julie for the further chairing. Thank you.
Well, I think, Debbie, that what voters should ask is, like in every country, personal integrity. I think it's very important. There is a presumption of exemplarity when people are elected to public offices. So that's very important. And then in terms of commitment, they really have to commit to found anti-corruption bodies and to ensure their independence. And lastly, because you asked me to be brief, corruption, abuse of power has two engines, which are concentration of power and secrecy. And candidates have to commit to checks and balances and to transparency. And those are the conditions for a democracy, not to limit itself to elections, but to be a permanent democracy with full inclusion of the citizens in the decision-making and in the information that is being shared with everybody.
Shall I follow?
Sorry,
So,
Suzanne. Yes, please
yeah.
do follow up. I was just saying thank you very much to Debbie, as she does have a day job and has to go off to it. But Suzanne.
Well said, Francois. I would like to refer to the last few elections where Transparency International New Zealand has asked all 6 major political parties to have a statement about their view on corruption. And it's been fascinating because that survey, the political parties always say that they're very strongly in favor of legislation that will reduce corruption in New Zealand, and that they all have anti-corruption strategies. I think with the performative approach to politics that we now have, it would be a good thing if Transparency International New Zealand could do this survey a bit earlier in the election campaign and get it out there for the public to see the politicians' answers, because those answers then can be used to hold them accountable after whoever's elected. Going back to another comment that Francois made about challenges with corruption and anti-corruption in countries, is that when you've got too much integrity or appear to think you are a country of integrity like New Zealand is, it's easy to be complacent. And so this fall in the Corruption Perception Index is a really great lever to be used now to say we can no longer afford to be complacent in New Zealand. It's having a direct impact on our trade, and we can't afford have an impact on our trade as a country who needs trade to increase its gross domestic product. And so I think getting politicians committed early on in the election to anti-corruption measures, and as Francois says, enforcement, going back to Dan and Rosa's study, the procurement basically needs enforcement of the rules of procurement after the procurements are made, not just during the bidding processes. But again, the other factor that I mentioned earlier is political party funding.
Yeah, thanks very much, Suzanne. It's all really relevant. I'm going to go to the questions because they're coming in.